Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to Deku at an Anti-Quirk Part 4. Last time on the What If, Class 1A held a sports festival, and after that, Zuko, Todoroki, and Ida, and the Pro Hero Native fought the Hero Killer, and survived. So now let's jump back into the What If. So right after the Hero Killer was knocked out, an ambulance took the four to the hospital, with Native getting his own room, and the three students sharing one. And the next day, the three got a visit from the chief of the Hosu police force, who gives them two options: either get the glory of beating the Hero Killer and get in trouble since they don't have licenses, or give it to Endeavor and don't suffer any consequences at all. And the three decided to give all the glory to Endeavor, and Manuel and Gran Torino got a suspension on their licenses since they didn't stop them. And when the adults leave the room, Todoroki and Ida ask Zuko about his super strengths, since they thought he only had one quirk. And Izuku's excuse is that he only learned about it recently, since his anti-quirk has been nullifying it his whole life. And the two believe him since they don't truly understand Izuku's quirk. And a couple of days later, they were released from the hospital because they were healed enough, but Ida still has nerve damage in his wrist, but Izuku is still fine. And the rest of the internship was used for Izuku to train his full cowling. So now we skip to the first day back, and that day they did the rescue hero training, which was a race to All Might. And at first everyone believed that Izuku would be left behind, since they believed Izuku's quirk would not be helpful. But when the race began, Izuku used his own form of full cowling, and he ran as fast as he could. But after a bit of time of being in first place, Izuku slips off a pipe, and that makes him finish last. And after the training, the class asks the same question about Izuku's quirk, and he gives them the same excuse he gave Ida and Todoroki, and they believed it as well. And after the training, All Might told Izuku to meet at the teacher's lounge at the end of the day. So now we skip to when Izuku meets up with All Might. All Might then tells Izuku how he's impressed about how he's been able to make One for All his own in such a short amount of time. Then he tells him about All for One. And when he finishes explaining who he was and how One for All was created, he says he's sorry for putting such a burden on him. But Izuku then smiles, saying that he's aiming to be number one, and if he can't handle him, then he doesn't deserve that spot. Then Izuku leaves to go home. So now we skip a couple of weeks, and it's time for the final exams. And everyone in Class 1A was able to get the same scores for the written exams as in the canon, both in the practice and the actual final. So now we skip to when the physical test began. And all the teams will be the exact same as in the canon. So when everything was ready, Bakugo and Izuku's test against All Might began. And at the start of the test, All Might punched from one side of the fake city, and that one punch was strong enough to create a clear path to the exit. And in this test, All Might doesn't have as many weights, with one on each arm and leg, since the teachers took Izuku's quirk into account, since he could just erase All Might's quirk. And when the dust settled from the punch, All Might rushes at the two, and before Izuku could react, he gets tossed by All Might and Bakugo gets flinged in the other direction. And after a couple of minutes, the two were able to get back up. And this time, Izuku uses his anti-quirk to surround his body, since before he had his full cowling activated, and his anti-quirk was in his hands. And when he was ready, Izuku jumped out of the building with One for All in his legs, and he ran to Bakugo, who was already fighting All Might again, and was currently pinned to the ground. Izuku, seeing this as a good opportunity, pulls out a dart and his blowgun, and he shoots the dart at All Might, with his anti-quirk in the dart. But before the dart hit All Might picked up Bakugo and he used him as a meat shield, making it so Bakugo is temporarily quirkless. Izuku then continues to run at All Might, and seeing Izuku run at him, All Might punches the ground, making a dust screen. Then he grabs a fallen lamppost, and when the dust settles, Izuku looks for All Might, and before he could react, All Might hits him with the post in the gut, launching him a couple of feet away. Then Izuku does his form of full cowling, and he does the same smoke screen All Might did. And not wanting to get touched, All Might jumps into the air as high as he could. But that wasn't Izuku's goal. His goal was to get Bakugo and run. And when the dust clears, the two are gone. And while they were hidden, they ran into a nearby alleyway. They then came up with a plan. And in this, they were actually able to come up with a plan without any issues, since Bakugo doesn't think that Izuku is too beneath him, and he is actually okay with working with him. And while they were coming up with the plan, All Might was running around the fake city trying to find the two. So when they were done planning, Izuku gave Bakugo two of his darts, which had Izuku's energy infused into them, so they should be able to make All Might weak for a couple of minutes. Bakugo then puts them in his pockets, and Bakugo gave Izuku one of his gloves that had his sweat stored up. Then they waited until All Might was about to walk past their alley, and when he did, Bakugo jumped out from the alley first, and he launched an explosion from his glove, which seemed to slow down All Might but not completely stopping him. Then Izuku jumps out from the alley behind All Might, and he used the glove at All Might's back. All Might then turned around and he grabbed onto Izuku's glove. Then he threw him at a nearby building, but while All Might was distracted, Bakugo stabbed All Might in the side with Izuku's darts, which made All Might start to lose his quirk, which made him start to get covered in smoke. But before All Might showed his true form, he punched the ground as hard as he could, making a dust cloud. And with Bakugo unable to see, he wasn't able to see All Might walk into the building next to him. And the moment he was hidden, All Might powered down and he went into his normal form. and when the cloud was gone, Bakugo was able to see that All Might wasn't there, so he began to look around. But before he could look too much, Izuku got back up and he ran to him, and he told them that they should make it to the exit. And with around 10 minutes left, Bakugo and Izuku passed the exam. So a couple of days later, Class 1A was told who passed and who failed the exams. And when the school day ended, they decided they should go shopping for things for the camp. But after a couple of minutes after they get there, they decide to split up to buy the things they want. And after a couple of minutes, someone puts their arm around Izuku, and he said that he's happy to see him again, since he hasn't seen him since the USJ. And hearing this, Izuku starts to activate his negative quirk, and he started to force his energy into Shigaraki's body, making him quirkless. But before he could do anything, Shigaraki started to speak. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. You saw the group of villains I had at the USJ, and if I signal my partner, a group of villains that size will appear. And this time there aren't any pro heroes to help you. And even if you did beat me, how many people will die because of you? So why don't you follow me and we have a talk?" Hearing this, Izuku wasn't scared, but he knew just in case he wasn't bluffing, he should follow Shigaraki, just so no one got hurt. And after following Shigaraki, the two then have a talk, and by the end of it, Shigaraki came to the conclusion that All Might is the source of all of his problems. And after he comes to this realization, Ochako appears. So saying there are more people, Shigaraki gets up and he starts to leave. And Izuku stays where he is just so no one dies. But before Shigaraki got too far, Izuku asked, "What is All for One's goal?" But Shigaraki, before hiding in the crowd, said that he doesn't have a clue what All for One wants. And an hour later, the mall gets shut down and Izuku gets taken to the police station for information. So now we skip a couple of days and it's time for the training camp. And after a couple hours of driving, Class 1A stops at a cliff in the woods, and there they meet the WWPC. And after a bit of talking, Pixie Bob threw them off the cliff via a landslide. And when they landed, they were told to get to the camp as fast as they could, and it took them until sunset to make it to the camp. And when they did, they were all tired, dirty, and covered in scratches. And everything happened the same that night, so Izuku learns about Koda's parents. So now we skip to the next day, and the training Izuku did was physical training, and the whole time he covered himself with his anti-energy, and one for all to the point where he is using 8%. So every time he moves, it puts a small strain on his body, and by the end of the day, he had a hard time moving. And when the students were eating, Izuku noticed that Koda wasn't there, so he got a plate of food and he went to go look for Koda. And after a bit of time, Izuku was able to find him on a cliff looking at the stars. The two then talk about why Izuku wanted to be a hero, and Koda said that he's just throwing his life away. And after around 10 minutes, Izuku puts down the plate of food, then leaves. So now we skip to the next day, and Izuku did the same training, but by the end of the day, Izuku was able to control 8% better, not to the point where he can fully use it, but he can use it more without feeling a strain on his body. And when the day's training was done, they had a test of courage, with all the groups being the same, with Izuku being alone. But before he could go in, he and the other people outside the forest could see that the forest was covered in blue flames. Then two villains start to walk out of the forest, and they fight Pixie Bob, Mandalay, and Tiger, while the students run to find a place to hide. But before Izuku did anything, he remembered that Koda is probably on the cliff still, so he tells Mandalay where he's going, and she gives him a small nod. Then Izuku does his form of full cowling at 7%, and he runs to the cliff. And after a couple of minutes, he was able to make it to the cliff. But by the time he got there, Koda was face to face with a giant villain who was just about to punch him. But before the fist hit Koda, Izuku jumped past the fist and he was able to push him out of the way. But while he was in midair, Izuku dropped his phone, and when it hit the ground, it broke, so Izuku couldn't call for help. Then the villain remembered that Izuku was on the list, and he asked if he knows where Bakugo is. And before Izuku could ask what he was talking about, the villain charged at Izuku, and Izuku in response starts to run at Muscular, with him still in full cowling. So when their hands collide, Izuku forces his energy into Muscular, making his muscles start to disappear, thus making him weaker. But when Muscular's quirk started to go away, he punched Izuku and he tried to run away. But Izuku was able to shake it off easily, and he punched Muscular in the gut as well, launching him at the mountain. Izuku then made sure he was knocked out. Then he grabbed a couple of sticks and covered them with his anti-quirk. Then he put them over Muscular, so while he was knocked out, he's still getting covered in Izuku's quirk. Then Koda got on Izuku's back, and they started to run into the forest to get back to camp. And after a couple of minutes, they run into Aizawa, who then asked if Izuku was in a fight, since his clothes were a bit dirty and he had a couple of scratches. Izuku says yes, and after a bit of talking, Izuku gives Koda to Aizawa. But before he leaves, he tells Izuku to give Mandalay a message. So after a couple of minutes, Izuku was able to make it back to the camp. And Pixie Bop was on the ground unconscious, bleeding from her head. And he saw Mandalay being flung towards one of the villains, but before she got too close, Tiger stopped her, and he punched Magna away. Then Izuku tells Mandalay to send the message Aizawa gave him, which was the students are now allowed to fight. And after the message got sent out, Izuku went after Magna, and with both Izuku and Tiger, Magna was defeated. Then Izuku began to run to look for Bakugo, and after a bit of time of running, Izuku gets pushed to the ground, and when he falls to the ground, he sees a tree next to him get hit by something, and when it gets hit, it falls falls over, and when he looks to the side, he sees who pushed him over. It was Shoji. He then asks what the giant monster thing is, and when Shoji hears this, he points to the center of the monster, and the person that was trapped in its forehead was Tokoyami. They then get back up and start running from Dark Shadow, who started to chase them, and while they were running, they came up with a plan to find Bakugo and Todoroki, since most likely Izuku wouldn't be able to hit Tokoyami without being hit himself, and they use Shoji's limbs as bait for Dark Shadow, and after a bit of running, they come across Bakugo and Todoroki, who are fighting the villain Moonfish. But right before they run into Moonfish, Shoji and Izuku jump over Moonfish with the help of Izuku's quirk. And before Moonfish could react, Dark Shadow hit Moonfish, launching him into a tree and knocking him out. And after Moonfish was knocked out, Todoroki and Bakugo used their quirks to create light to make Dark Shadow smaller. And when he was small enough, Izuku put his hand on Tokoyami's shoulder, and he put some of his energy into Tokoyami, just enough so it weakened his quirk, until Tokoyami was able to get control back. And when that was taken care of, the group then tried to come up with a plan to get Bakugo back to camp. And they decided to have Izuku and Bakugo in the back, so Izuku could protect Bakugo in case a villain appeared behind them. And after a bit of walking, the group comes across Sue stuck to a tree, and Ochako getting her blood drained by a villain. And when she notices the group, she immediately leaves without looking back. The group then makes sure the two are okay. They then tell Ochako and Sue they are bringing Bakugo back to the camp. But when they tell them, Ochako says that Bakugo isn't there, and when they look behind them, they see not only is Bakugo gone, Izuku and Tokoyami are gone as well. So now we jump back a couple of minutes, and while they were walking, Izuku was in his full cowling, just in case a villain appeared. But before he could react, him, Bakugo, and Tokoyami got imprisoned in blue marbles, since even though Izuku's hands had the anti-quirk, his whole body didn't, so he didn't have enough power to stop it. So now we jump back to the present, and when they notice the three are gone, they look around to see where they went. But before they could search too much, they hear a voice above them, and when they look up, they see someone in a coat with a mask. And then he says he's the one that took the three, since they could be very useful to them. Todoroki then launches a wave of fire and ice at the villain, but he was too fast and he was able to jump over them. Then he started to run away on the trees. And seeing him run away, the group tries to run after him, but eventually they come up with a plan which was the same as in the canon. So Shoji and Todoroki, with the help of Ochako and Sue, launch themselves. And when they get launched, they tackle Mr. Compressed to the ground. And the place they landed at was the villain's rendezvous point. And when they landed, Mr. Compressed turned himself into a marble and he threw himself away from the two. And when he was far enough, he uncompressed himself. Then the two groups fought, and after a bit of time, Mr. Compressed shows the three marbles in his mouth. But when he reveals them, a laser beam comes out of nowhere, and it hits him in the face, making him drop the three marbles. And Shoji and Todoroki ran for the three marbles, and Shoji was able to grab the one containing Tokoyami. But Todoroki wasn't fast enough, and Dabi was able to grab both Izuku and Bakugo's marbles. Then Dabi pushed Todoroki away, and shortly after talking for a bit, the villains leave with Izuku and Bakugo. Then hours later, ambulances arrive to take the injured people to the hospital, and the cops arrive to take Muscular Magna to jail. And that's not really the What If. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.